I was kicked out of my family's home on Christmas, and months later, I returned for dinner with a surprise. On Christmas Eve, I was kicked out of the house where I grew up by the people who should have welcomed me. The rejection I experienced that night broke me in ways I didn't know were possible. For months I walked through an emotional desert, trying to understand where I had failed, and if I would ever truly smile again. But little by little, with the help of unexpected people and a strength I didn't even know I possessed, I began to rebuild what had been taken from me. My self-esteem, my voice, and my hope. And as the next Christmas approached, something within me told me it was time to go back. Not for them but for myself. This is not a story of revenge. It's a story of silent triumph, self-love, and how pain can be transformed into light. I discovered difficult truths, reconnected lost bonds, and understood that sometimes, the family that heals us isn't the one we came from, but the one we choose to build. Thank you for being here. Follow along to the end and tell me in the comments where you are reading from. I want to know how far this story has reached. The snow fell lightly as I parked in front of the house where I grew up. The gate was decorated with flashing lights, but to me that sparkle seemed forced, almost mocking. I took a deep breath before getting out of the car. As if preparing for a test I already knew I would fail. When I rang the doorbell I heard shuffling footsteps, and then her gaze. Summer stared at me as if my presence were an inconvenient mistake. My mother said nothing, just made space for me to enter, as if I were an unwanted guest. The smell of roasted turkey filled my nostrils but my stomach churned. Every detail of the house seemed the same, but I felt like a stranger there. My father just nodded with a shy smile as always, while Ruby averted her gaze. Everything in me screamed to run away. I went into the living room trying to appear serene, but my body was tense, as if carrying invisible armor. Summer sat across from me, her cold gaze piercing my skin like ice. The clock showed 6 in the evening, but time seemed frozen there. That house, decorated for celebration, never seemed so distant to me. Something was wrong and I felt it in my bones. The initial conversation was superficial, with comments about the weather and traffic. But behind the forced smiles, there was a heavy silence, almost deafening. I sat at the table like someone occupying a borrowed seat, hoping the night would end soon. That's when she stared at me again, and something in her eyes sent shivers down my spine. I should have understood what that look meant. It started with a simple, almost innocent question. "And how is work at that little hospital?" I smiled, trying to hide my irritation, calmly replying that I liked what I did. But before I could finish, Summer was already starting her litany about wasted choices and what she considered a mediocre life. My heart raced and I tried to argue, but I was interrupted. "You had so much potential. And you chose to hide," she said, as if my path were a public shame. Ruby lowered her head. My father pretended to be busy with his plate, and their silence hurt more than any words spoken. It was as if my presence there was an inconvenience to be tolerated only out of obligation. I tried to take a deep breath and maintain my composure, but each new sentence was a stab. She spoke as if I had failed as a daughter, as a woman, as a person. None of my achievements mattered to her. To Summer, I was the eternal disappointment. I felt my eyes burn, but I wouldn't let her see me cry. Ruby cast a quick glance at me but remained silent. I waited for anyone to break that cycle, to say enough, or at least change the subject. But everyone chose silence. The dinner grew cold in front of me, but the humiliation burned. That wasn't a dialogue. It wasn't an argument. It was a judgment. It was quick, like thunder cutting through a serene sky. Summer stood up, adjusted her napkin on the table and said clearly, "If you don't know your place, perhaps you should find another." For a second I thought I had misunderstood. But her gaze left no doubt. Ruby's eyes widened, but she said nothing. My father remained still, almost petrified. The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet. I stood up slowly, as if each movement required the strength of 1,000 wars. I still waited for anyone to intervene. A gesture, a word, an outstretched hand. But no one moved. It was as if they had all conspired in that scene before I arrived. The rejection was as clear as the snow falling outside. I said nothing. I just walked to the door, trying to maintain what dignity I had left. With each step, I felt my heart shatter. I opened the door and was greeted by the cold night wind. I didn't look back. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing my devastated face. I just kept walking aimlessly. The street was deserted, silent, as if the whole world had stopped to watch my fall. Snow accumulated in my hair, and my steps left traces of pain on the wet asphalt. When I finally reached the car, my hands trembled so much I could barely open the door. I closed the door behind me, but something inside me also closed. That night, I ceased to be a daughter in that house. The days following Christmas were gray, as if the light had left the world with me that night. I woke up, put on my uniform, and went to the hospital on autopilot. Each corridor seemed colder, each patient more distant. I forced myself to smile, to pay attention, but inside there was only a void. The rejection from my own mother hurt physically, as if I had lost an invisible limb. Cody was the only one who noticed. He didn't ask right away, just observed. Until one day, during coffee in the cafeteria, he broke the silence. "You're not here, Daisy. You're just walking." His eyes were filled with sincere concern. I couldn't pretend for long. Something in his kindness dismantled my armor. That night I cried in my room like a child. I cried for the daughter I tried to be, for the woman who tried to hide the pain, and for the emptiness that consumed everything. Working kept me functional but not alive. The echo of my mother's words still pounded in my mind. I was discarded like something worthless, defenseless. And now everything in me screamed in silence. At the end of the next shift, Cody offered me a ride. I refused, but he insisted, saying I didn't need to say anything, just be there. It was on that journey that he looked at me firmly and said what I didn't expect to hear. "You don't have to pretend everything is okay with me," Cody said. I was finishing up charting when I saw Ruby at the ward door. My heart pounded, and for a moment I thought I was hallucinating. She looked nervous, clutching her purse strap tightly. "I need to talk to you. Now." My first instinct was to refuse, but there was something in her gaze that made me give in. We went to an empty room next to the emergency room. She started hesitantly, but soon the words came with devastating weight. "Mom." She planned everything. She talked for weeks about putting you in your place. I was paralyzed, speechless. Ruby continued, her eyes welling up, saying that Summer had prepared that dinner as a pretext. She wanted you out of her life without dirtying her own hands. Each sentence from her was like a punch. That night wasn't a tantrum. It was a meticulously cold execution. My mind raced, trying to understand how a mother could act like that. Ruby said she tried to intervene, but she was afraid of being pushed away too. It was as if my entire childhood made sense all at once. The absences, the silences, the glances. It was all part of something bigger. Ruby carefully touched my arm, apologizing. But I could barely look at her. My head was on fire, my chest tight as if I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just rejection. It was betrayal. It was all a setup, Daisy. Mom wanted to get rid of you. I returned home like a ghost. I closed the curtains, turned off my cell phone, and deleted all notifications from the world. I didn't want anyone, no answers, no promises. I just wanted to disappear for a few days and reorganize my pieces. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, reliving childhood moments that now had another meaning. Even the happy memories were contaminated. I was overwhelmed by a silent rage, by a sadness that burned within. I didn't know where to put so much abandonment. I felt disgusted with myself for still expecting something from that house, from that woman. I remembered Grandma, the only one who truly saw me, and how she was pushed away without explanation. Now everything seemed part of a hidden, cruel, and planned story. I wrote a message to Cody, thanking him for his support, but saying I needed space. He replied with a heart emoji. I didn't need to say anything else. Deep down, he already knew. The world seemed so small and at the same time so heavy for me. Each tick of the clock pushed me further away from that family. I ate what was left in the fridge, slept at random hours, and stopped counting the days. The resentment numbed me. I didn't want to go back, I didn't want to mend things. I just wanted to disappear from that sick circle. If she wanted me out of her life, it was done. But no matter how hard I tried, the emptiness didn't leave me. That afternoon seemed just like all the others until I walked into the corner market. I just wanted to buy milk and bread. Maybe something sweet to distract from the sadness. That's when, between the canned goods shelves, I heard a familiar voice. I turned slowly and there he was, Travis Bell. The same brown eyes, the same calm demeanor, but now with more mature features. We stared at each other for a few seconds as if time had stopped. He smiled, a little awkwardly, and I returned it with a hesitant nod. It had been years since we'd seen each other, since before he moved away. We talked quickly, exchanging shallow questions, avoiding deep dives. But the reunion was like a warm blanket on a cold night. Travis mentioned he had recently moved back, taking care of his ailing father. I was surprised he still remembered my name, my smile. Before he left, he offered to get coffee sometime. I said maybe. When I left the market, I realized I was smiling genuinely, for the first time in weeks. Something in me warmed up. I went home with the groceries in my hands and a persistent thought in my mind. Maybe not everything was lost. Maybe there was still someone who saw me beyond the pain. You disappeared for years, Travis. We started with one coffee, then another. The conversations became longer, lighter. We talked about music, childhood, everyday silly things. It was so easy to be with him, so different from everything I had experienced recently. Travis had a way of listening that made me feel seen. And I realized how much I missed that. He didn't ask too many questions, but he didn't shy away either. When he laughed at my jokes or recalled old stories, something within me reconnected. Those afternoons became little breaths in the chaos. We didn't talk about my family, but he knew, and respected my silence. There was no rush between us. We walked together through the park after work, with no particular destination. Sometimes he would tell me what it was like to live far away, how returning to the city had reopened old wounds. There was a tenderness in his gestures that didn't need translation. And even without promises, I felt like I was starting to trust again. It was a new kind of security. I still woke up with the pain of rejection, but now there were good morning messages too. Travis made me feel light, as if the pain wasn't all that I was. It's strange, but with you I breathe better. On an especially cold night, Travis told me something that changed everything. We were sitting on the hood of his car, looking at the starless sky. He spoke in a low voice, almost whispering. He was kicked out of his home at 22 for not following what his family expected of him. For years, he lived with the guilt of not being the ideal son. I listened in silence, my heart aching. He didn't cry, but his eyes told everything. He recounted how he had to build his self-esteem from scratch. How he learned to love himself even without the applause of those who raised him. I saw myself in him in a frightening and comforting way. For the first time, I felt I wasn't the only exile. His loneliness fit perfectly with mine. We looked at each other for long seconds without saying anything. There was no need. Shared pain has a way of uniting without noise. I wanted to hug him, but I held back the gesture. He respected my pace and I respected his. But in that instant I knew we were closer than we imagined. Not by chance but by survival. There, in that complicit silence, something between us solidified. And what was once companionship turned into refuge. Maybe we've always been the right kind of wrong. For the first time in weeks I slept without crying. Going back to the hospital after so many days at home was like learning to walk again. The corridors seemed brighter. Or maybe I was less dim. Cody noticed the change and greeted me with a tight hug. During our break, he looked at me seriously, leaning his elbows on the laminate table in the staff room. You're doing well, but you don't have to do all this alone. I remained silent for a few seconds, wondering if I was really ready to open another kind of door. He spoke about therapy with the naturalness of someone who just wants to help, without judgment. He said he knew an amazing professional and could book the first session for me if I wanted. I hesitated but eventually accepted. Maybe it was time to organize the mess inside me. The first session was uncomfortable. Speaking aloud about feelings I had always hidden was like peeling off old scabs. But little by little I relaxed. The psychologist, with a sweet gaze, guided me gently. By the end of the consultation I felt like I had let go of a weight, small but real. I went home with a full head, but a slightly lighter heart. As I left the hospital, Cody was waiting for me in the car. He smiled when he saw me, and I, for the first time, smiled back without forcing it. You don't have to carry everything alone, you know? In one of the following sessions, she asked me about a happy childhood memory. I closed my eyes and almost effortlessly saw my grandmother's face. The smell of corn cake invaded my memory, and with it, the sound of her low laugh. I remembered the times I hid in her lap, escaping my mother's cold stares. With her I was enough. She called me little star, said my light was too special to fade. And even when I got bad grades, when I cried for feeling alone, she never diminished me. Those afternoons in the backyard, among flowers and invented stories, were my secret refuge. I missed a time when love seemed simple. True, the therapist made me see that her presence might have been what saved me, even if just barely. It was then that I realized the size of the hole her absence left. I never understood why my mother kept her distant, even in her last years. Anger and mystery mixed within me. I needed to understand more. I needed to remember more. I left that session with tears in my eyes and a more vibrant heart. It wasn't just pain. It was memory, it was affection. She said I was a star, even when no one saw my light. It was a cloudy afternoon when Travis showed up with 2 mugs of hot chocolate. I invited him in, and he settled on the sofa as if he belonged there. We talked about trivialities until suddenly silence fell. He looked at me like someone carrying something for too long. I felt the air change even before I heard the words. I need to tell you something I've held on to for years, he began. My heart sped up. He talked about how he had admired me since adolescence, but never had the courage to approach for fear of messing things up. He said that every time he saw me trying to be loved by someone who didn't know how to love, he felt like protecting me. And that now, seeing everything I had faced, he just wanted to be close. I was speechless. It was a lot to digest, and at the same time it felt so natural. He didn't demand anything, just offered. His affection, his presence, his truth. I felt seen in a way I had never felt before. And strangely, I wasn't afraid. It was as if he had opened a window within me. A window I didn't even know existed. I moved my hand to his and left it there without saying anything. For the first time, something in me didn't want to run away. If you let me, I'll stay. My heart for the first time felt no fear. After therapy and remembering my grandmother, something began to deeply bother me. Why, in the last years of her life, were we always supervised when we visited her? I remembered the time Summer stood at the door, rushing us as if she feared what Grandma might say. It was as if there was something to hide. Longing turned into suspicion. I talked to Ruby about it, but she just shook her head, saying she also felt there were unresolved secrets there. I started mentally reviewing every detail of our visits, every veiled prohibition. I remembered a time when I tried to sleep at Grandma's house and my mother threw a fit. At the time, I thought it was an exaggeration. Today it seemed like control. The more I thought about it, the clearer became the void left by the absence of the only person who truly loved me. It was as if my mother had erased the last pages of that story with black ink. A part of me wanted to believe it was just paranoia. But the other part knew. Summer was always afraid of feelings she couldn't manipulate. And true love was one of them. I picked up an old photo of Grandma and held it to my chest. I made a silent promise to discover what had been denied to us. Mom never let us see her alone. A few days later, Cody showed up at the hospital with a box in his hands. He said he had helped organize part of the old hospital storage room, where some of my grandmother's belongings had been stored after her death. I didn't even know it existed. I opened the box right there, trembling. Among albums, embroidered handkerchiefs, and books, there was a brown envelope with my name handwritten on it. With trembling fingers, I opened the letter. It was from my grandmother. She spoke about me with such affection that I cried before finishing the second paragraph. She said she saw me as an extension of what was good in the world, that she regretted not being able to be closer. She mentioned interrupted conversations and supervised visits. There was a tone of farewell there, but also of warning. She knew Summer prevented our relationship and regretted it. She asked me not to let love die within me, even if everything around seemed hostile. Her words pierced my defenses like a precise arrow. Why was that letter never given to me? How many other truths were hidden? A cold fury grew within me, mixed with sadness. Cody by my side squeezed my hand. She loved you, Daisy. A lot. I could only think one thing. This letter changes everything. And she knew. The need to understand grew like a fire within me. I called Derek, my uncle, and asked him to come to my house. When he arrived, he seemed suspicious, as if he knew what was coming. I showed him the letter, spoke about my memories, and waited. For a few seconds he remained silent, staring at the envelope as if it were a mirror of the past. He sighed deeply before starting. He said that my grandmother and Summer always had a difficult relationship, marked by jealousy and accusations. He said that when Grandma's health worsened, Summer practically isolated her from the family, justifying that it was best for everyone. But Derek knew there was something more. A fear that Grandma would talk too much, revealing unhealed wounds. He confessed that, despite disagreeing, he remained silent to maintain peace. He said he thought it was just a phase, that one day everything would resolve itself. But now, seeing the pain in my eyes, he blamed himself for having been remiss. I should have done more, Daisy. Forgive me. I listened to everything with a heavy heart, but also with clarity. My mother always controlled everything, even affections. I stood up and walked to the window, trying to absorb everything. Truth always leaves marks, even when it liberates. Your mother was always afraid of losing control. What if my family was built on lies? It was early evening when I heard insistent knocking at the door. When I opened it, I found Ruby with tears streaming down her face, her body hunched, as if seeking shelter from the world. For a second I couldn't move. She looked at me with a desperation I didn't recognize, and before I could say anything she murmured, "I fought with Mom. I left home." Her voice trembled and her eyes carried guilt. Ruby entered without me needing to invite her. She sat on the sofa and burst into tears. She said she couldn't live pretending anymore, that for a long time she had followed Summer out of fear of being rejected as I was. But something changed when she read Grandma's letter, which Cody had shown her days earlier. There she understood what I had lost. Between sobs, Ruby asked for my forgiveness. Not just for her silence but for participating in the silence that hurt me. Hearing those words broke my heart, but also began to mend it. It still hurt, but it was no longer a lonely pain. She held my hand and for the first time, I felt her as a true sister. I didn't say everything was okay because it wasn't yet. But I let her stay. And there, side by side, we started something new, a reconstruction. I should have been on your side. The cohabitation was strange in the first few days. Two bodies under the same roof trying to learn to exist without masks. We shared coffee, silences, and some memories that once seemed too distant. Ruby began to tell stories I never had a chance to hear. About fears, wrong choices, and the constant attempt to please our mother. For the first time I heard her true voice. Little by little, we started laughing at silly things again. A childhood memory, a recipe that went wrong, an old movie. The barriers began to give way, and a silent complicity was born there. We were no longer invisible rivals on our mother's chessboard. We were survivors of the same shipwreck, trying to learn to swim together. We made a promise not to repeat the patterns that hurt us. We talked about therapy, about freedom, about rebuilding. We discovered that we could disagree without fear, and that there was love even in differences. It was a new love, fragile but true. A bond that no longer depended on anyone's approval. In that house full of emotional cracks, something beautiful was born. Something that resisted time, pain, and silence. We are different, but we are blood. On the night Travis came to dinner with us, something inside me warmed up. Seeing him and Ruby talking like old acquaintances gave me a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in a long time. After she went to sleep, I sat with him on the porch. The sky was clear, and the stars seemed closer. I stayed silent for a while until I found courage. "I thought about going back for Christmas," I said softly. He looked at me calmly without surprise. "Not for them. For me." I explained that I didn't want revenge, nor acceptance. I just wanted to prove to myself that that pain no longer defined me, that I could return to the same place, but as a different woman, one who no longer needed to beg for affection. Travis squeezed my hand, as if understanding without needing words. He told me he would support me, that he would be there. Not to confront anyone but to remind me of who I was. I stayed silent for a moment, feeling a new strength grow within me. Still fragile but real. I looked at the streetlights, thinking about everything that had happened since that night. For the first time, the idea of going back didn't scare me so much. Not for them. For me. But I still lacked the courage to face it. The phone rang early in the afternoon, and I saw Uncle Derek's name on the screen. I hesitated before answering, wondering what he might want after so long in silence. His voice sounded different, lighter, almost regretful. He said the family would have Christmas dinner again and that he thought it was important for me to be there. "Things have changed, Daisy," he asserted, almost in a whisper. I remained silent, trying to understand if it was a sincere invitation or another emotional trap. But he insisted, saying that Ruby had talked to everyone, that summer was quieter, and that maybe things could be different. Still, my heart felt heavy. Returning to that house was like walking through a minefield. But something in his voice made me stop. He didn't try to convince me, he just left the invitation hanging in the air. "You don't have to answer now," he said. "But maybe you should see for yourself." When I hung up, I held the phone in my hand for a while, staring into space. This could be the beginning of a new chapter, or a repetition of the past. Deciding to go back would be more than attending a dinner. It would be facing everything I was, and showing who I had become. "Maybe you should see for yourself." When I told Travis about the invitation, he just looked at me tenderly. I expected more questions, maybe advice, but he just took a deep breath and said, "What do you feel you need to do?" I remained silent, staring at the teacup in my hands. I didn't know exactly. I just knew that the pain still lived within me. But perhaps it was time to empty that dark room. He approached and held my hands firmly, like someone anchoring a boat about to depart. "Don't let the pain write the end of your story," he said with the serenity only he possessed. "Sometimes, forgiveness is the most silent victory." It wasn't about accepting what they did to me. It was about freeing myself from the weight I had carried for so long. That phrase echoed within me for hours. I began to think of forgiveness not as a gift to others, but as a breath of fresh air for myself. A way of existing without dragging the chains of others' mistakes. It wasn't easy and it never would be. But perhaps it was possible. Perhaps forgiving was my way of moving forward. I looked at Travis and knew at that instant that he would walk beside me. And that made all the difference. Sometimes, forgiveness is the most silent victory. The next morning, I put on the blue blouse Grandma gave me when I turned 18. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who carried scars but also strength. I felt something different in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was determination. I called Ruby and told her I would go to dinner. She cried on the other end of the line, promising she would be with me. But I needed to do this for myself. I took the box stored in the closet, the envelope in my hands. Inside was the news that would change everything. I was pregnant. I found out weeks before, but only now could I look at it with courage. The child growing inside me was a promise of a new beginning. Not just for me, but for my entire story. I would not return empty-handed. Going back to that house would be the greatest act of love I had ever done for myself. They expected the same Daisy, fragile, insecure, silent. But this time they would see someone different. A woman who had rebuilt her own foundations. A daughter who was now a mother, and who knew exactly the value of her own light. I took a deep breath and put the envelope in my bag. What awaited me there I didn't know. But I was ready to show the truth. They expect the same Daisy. They will meet another. And this time I would return with my hands full of self-love. The house gate was decorated as always, with twinkling lights and well-arranged garlands. But nothing on the facade could disguise the weight it carried behind those walls. I took a deep breath, adjusted my coat, and rang the doorbell. For a few seconds there was absolute silence, until the door opened and everyone stared at me as if they had seen a ghost. My presence was a cut in the rehearsed script of the night. Summer froze in place, her hand still holding the dish towel. Ruby smiled timidly, and my father, as always, avoided direct eye contact. The room was full, but suddenly a void opened between me and them. No words were spoken. Only the sound of flashing lights insisted on filling the space between us. I walked with firm steps to the entrance of the dining room. The smell of dinner, the usual decorations, everything seemed like a repeated scene, but my heart beat with a different frequency. I was no longer the broken daughter who left there months ago. Being back was an act of courage, and I knew it. Even if no one said so. My arrival was a silent earthquake. And that was enough to dismantle all their certainties. No one imagined I would have the courage. Summer quickly composed herself, like someone who knows how to act even when the stage collapses. She came up to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "You came? What a surprise." The tone was sweet, but the discomfort was evident. She gestured for me to come in, as if everything was normal. Ruby approached and for the first time stood between the two of us. My sister offered me the seat next to her, not next to our mother, as was customary. That was a small gesture but immense. Summer noticed and pursed her lips. The tension grew with each passing minute, but I was calm. Not because everything was fine but because I finally knew where my ground was. During dinner, Summer tried to maintain appearances, asking trivial questions and deflecting any delicate subject. But Ruby didn't let it go unchallenged. When our mother made an observation about choices that shape the future, Ruby firmly replied, "And sometimes we have to undo what was wrongly shaped." The silence that followed was revealing. Seeing my sister break that barrier gave me strength. For the first time, it wasn't just me against everything. Mom isn't the only one with a loud voice here anymore. As conversations glided over full plates and empty glances, my mind drifted away. I observed every detail of the house as if seeing it for the first time. The living room curtain, the worn rug, the picture frames that always showed a family that never truly existed. Nothing there had changed. The walls were the same, the rehearsed words, the silences too. But I had changed. Every breath I took in that room was proof of it. I no longer reacted as before. I didn't shrink. I didn't seek approval in eyes that had always denied me affection. I felt a new strength within me, subtle but firm. It was as if my presence there disproved years of silence and submission. My gaze fell on the sofa where I had so often cried in secret. On the stairs where I heard muffled screams. On the kitchen where my grandmother gave me her last hugs before being taken away. Everything seemed like a time capsule, but I no longer fit there. And that was no longer a pain. It was a realization. I was the same on the outside, yes. But inside something new had been born. I was the same on the outside, but inside. The moment of truth was approaching. Dinner continued like a poorly rehearsed play. Dishes being served, glasses clinking, voices forcing normalcy. But behind every word was a thick silence, as if everyone avoided what mattered most, my presence. No one dared to mention the previous Christmas, nor the night I was kicked out. I waited, breathed, and then decided not to wait anymore. I looked up and met every face around the table. I felt a tremor in my hands, but I didn't back down. My words came with firmness, without anger, but with truth. I know no one here expected to see me. And perhaps you would have preferred that I hadn't come back. But I didn't come back for you. I came back for myself. The silence was immediate, like an invisible blow that swept across the table. Summer clutched her napkin tightly, and my father lowered his eyes. Ruby watched me with restrained pride. I continued. I came back because I want to close this chapter in the only way left to me. At peace with myself. My hands rested in my lap, firm, serene. For the first time, I was in command of the narrative. At that table where I had so often been invisible, I was finally seen, not because I shouted, but because I existed with integrity. I didn't come back for you. I came back for myself. With everyone still silent, I took the envelope from my bag. I placed it on the table, but I didn't need to open it. I want to share something that changes everything, at least for me. Everyone looked at me, some curious, others tense. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for a second and said, "I'm expecting a child." The shock was visible, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. No one spoke immediately. I continued, unhurried. "I found out a few weeks ago, and at first I was scared. But now I know that this life growing inside me is my new beginning." My words were not a defense. They were freedom. I looked up at Summer. And it's for him that I choose to forgive. Not to forget. But not to carry this burden forward. I felt my heart race. The past wouldn't disappear, but it would stop defining me. I don't return to this family as one begging for space. I don't return to fit in. I return to say that I no longer accept being small where I was born to grow. A lump formed in my throat, but it didn't stop me from continuing. The liberation was lighter than I imagined. It was real, it was mine. I forgive, but I don't forget. And I won't diminish myself again. The weight of the silence was greater than any words spoken until then. Spoons stopped in midair, gazes averted. Summer remained motionless, like a statue wounded in her own rigidity. For a second I thought she would explode, but she didn't. No words, no arguments. just her eyes fixed on the void. For the first time, she wasn't in control. My father cleared his throat but said nothing. Ruby squeezed my hand under the table, and that gesture was everything. It was strange how silence could say so much. There was discomfort, yes, but also contained admiration. As if somehow they knew they could never look at me the same way again. The quietness of that room was not cold. It was the sound of change. It was the end of an era of submission, and the beginning of something I was still discovering. I didn't expect apologies. I didn't expect redemption. But there, in that instant, the imbalance of the table became my foundation. I was standing whole and they knew it. Summer finally moved her eyes to me, but said nothing. She just lowered her eyes. In that moment, I recovered everything that had been taken from me. Time passed with the delicacy of one who respects wounds. My belly grew, as did the love between Travis and me. He spoke to the baby every night, as if they were already old friends. Our days were simple, but full of a peace I had never known. Ruby visited us often, bringing fruits, laughter, and new stories. She helped set up the nursery, gave opinions on names, and told me what she read about motherhood. Our bonds, once fragile, were now firm and alive. It was strange and beautiful to see how we became pillars for each other. Travis treated her like a sister, and I finally felt like I wasn't alone anymore. We had created something new. Amidst appointments, shopping, and discoveries, I realized I was being reborn. Not as the rejected daughter, but as a whole woman. Sometimes at night I would look at the two of them sitting on the sofa and feel like crying, not from pain but from gratitude. It had taken losing everything to discover what was essential. And now I understood what home was. The family I had always dreamed of didn't come ready-made. It came in pieces, rebuilt with love, choice, and courage. I never thought family could be this. During a session with my therapist, I talked about how different my story could have been if, back then, someone had listened to me. Someone who would say, "You are not wrong for being who you are." That conversation planted an idea that stayed with me. That's how the group was born. We started with 4 women in a small room at the hospital. All of them shared the common experience of abandonment, judgment, or the pain of being excluded by their families. The first meeting was a collective cry, but also a sigh of relief. We were no longer alone. Over time, the group grew. We gained a name, a permanent room, and even support from the administration. More than emotional support, we created an emotional shelter. There we shared wounds and healing. Each story was unique, but the feelings were the same. The desire for belonging, the fear of not being enough, the hope of starting over. Between held hands and long hugs, I realized there was something greater uniting us. A love that doesn't need a surname. A bond made of empathy. At the end of each meeting, we would turn off the lights with a candle lit in the center. A reminder that, even in the darkness, we are beacons for one another. We are lights for one another. In the last week before Christmas, I wrote a letter to my son. I hadn't met him yet, but I already knew he would change everything in me. I picked up the paper and with trembling hands, began to write not about plans but about feelings. I told him about my pains, my struggles, my falls. But, most importantly, about the courage to keep going. I spoke about love, the kind I found in pieces but which now overflowed. I told him he was desired even before he existed, and that he would never need to earn affection with effort. I promised that he would be heard, welcomed, celebrated for being who he is, and that he would never carry the weight of silence as an inheritance. That truth would always have a place at the table. I put the letter in a blue envelope, with a future date and address. One day he would read it, and he would know that he came into the world out of love, not absence. That his mother learned the hard way the value of loving herself first, and that he would grow up surrounded by the light that I so often lacked. I had transformed my pain into a promise. When I finished, I cried. But this time I cried in peace. You will never doubt that you are loved. And so my Christmas gained a new meaning. A new beginning. Now, I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever experienced something similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the end screen that you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.